Introduction. By the time I had written the first 3 Lucky Starr books, I was so sick of the Paul French pseudonym I could hardly stand to look at them. I remember that one reviewer, who hated all the books I had written, and who was long since sunk into total and deserved oblivion, wrote a review in which he praised a Paul French book, and I wrote and I told him that Paul French was Isaac Asimov. Ha ha. Then, too, people who found out that Paul French was Isaac Asimov would say things like, Isaac Asimov is a respectable professor of biochemistry who writes science fiction under the name of Paul French, hoping that no one will ever find out that he does such things. You have no idea how that infuriated and frustrated me. I wrote all my science fiction but the Lucky Starr novels under my own name. I was proud of science fiction. I had no intention of hiding my work in that field under a pseudonym. I couldn't change, however, or I thought I couldn't. I therefore wrote 3 more books under the Paul French byline: Lucky Starr and the Big Sun of Mercury, Lucky Starr and the Moons of Jupiter, and Lucky Starr and the Rings of Saturn. However, I desperately began to make the books as much like Isaac Asimov books as I could. I dropped every last vestige of the Space Ranger bit. I emphasized the mystery story aspects of the books even further since, by then, everyone knew I was specializing in the science fiction mystery story. I even mentioned the 3 laws of robotics, which were well known to be used only by me. After the 6th Lucky Starr adventure, the press of other work forced me to abandon the series. When eventually paperback publishers decided to put out their own editions of the book, I took a deep breath and said, "Not unless you will put my real name on them." And they did. From then on, in a number of editions, both hardcover and softcover, the books have been presented as by Isaac Asimov writing as Paul French. Thank goodness. I wish I could handle the scientific facts in the books as easily. Unfortunately, scientific advances after the books in this volume were written completely changed what we thought we knew about the planets. For instance, in Lucky Starr and the Big Sun of Mercury, the plot hinges on the fact that Mercury faces only one side to the sun at all times. That's what astronomers had thought for 3/4 of a century. In 1965, however, 9 years after I'd published the book, astronomers discovered that Mercury does not face one side to the sun at all times. It rotates slowly so that every portion of the planet experiences both day and night. Please remember that when you read the book, but pretend that you're reading about a different Mercury, the one that was thought to exist in the 1950s. Then again, consider Lucky Starr and the Moons of Jupiter. We now know, as a result of probes that passed through the Jupiter system from 1973 onward, that Jupiter is surrounded by a very large and intense magnetic field that accumulated vast quantities of energetic electrically charged particles. It would be difficult or even impossible for spaceships to encounter those charged particles without killing any human beings on board. What's more, we know a great many details about the satellites we didn't know before. Io, for instance, is an active volcanic planet, with volcanoes erupting constantly and spewing sulfur all over the planet. Europa has a glacier that covers all of it with, perhaps, a liquid ocean underneath. And there are other small satellites of Jupiter even closer than Amalthea is. There was no way I could guess any of this in the 1950s. Lucky Starr and the Rings of Saturn survived somewhat better, but probes in the late 1970s and early 1980s have shown us that the rings are very complicated affairs, consisting of hundreds and perhaps thousands of ringlets. Also, there are a number of small satellites that astronomers never saw from their distant post on Earth. It would have been such fun to put in all that stuff and to describe a crater on Mimas so large that the collision that formed it must have almost shattered the satellite. But there was no way I could have guessed except through sheer luck. In any case, I trust that you will enjoy the series, while making allowances for the fact that they were written in the 1950s, with the astronomical knowledge of the time. Chapter 1: The Ghosts of the Sun. Lucky Starr and his small friend, John Bigman Jones, followed the young engineer up the ramp toward the airlock that led to the surface of the planet Mercury. Lucky thought, at least things are breaking fast. He'd have been on Mercury only an hour. He had scarcely time to do more than see his ship, the Shooting Star, safely stowed in the underground hangar. He had met only the technicians who had handled the landing red tape and seen to his ship. Those technicians, that is, and Scott Mindes, the engineer in charge of Project Light. It had been almost as though the young man had been lying in wait. Almost at once he had suggested a trip to the surface, to see some of the sights he had explained. Lucky did not believe that, of course. The engineer's small-chinned face had been haunted with trouble, and his mouth twitched as he spoke. His eyes slid away from Lucky's cool, level glance. Yet Lucky had agreed to visit the surface. As yet, all he knew of the troubles on Mercury was that they posed a ticklish problem for the Council of Science. He was willing to go along with Mindes and see where that led him. As for Bigman Jones, he was always glad to follow Lucky anywhere and any time, for any reason and no reason. But it was Bigman whose eyebrows lifted as all three were getting into their suits. He nodded almost unnoticeably toward the holster attached on Mindy's suit. Lucky nodded calmly in return. He, too, had noted that protruding from the holster was the butt of a heavy caliber blaster. The young engineer stepped out onto the surface of the planet first. Lucky Starr followed, and Bigman came last. For the moment, they lost contact with one another in the nearly total darkness. Only the stars were visible, bright and hard in the cold airlessness. Bigman recovered first. The gravity here on Mercury was almost exactly equal to that on his native Mars. The Martian nights were almost as dark. The stars in its night sky were almost as brilliant. His troubled voice sounded brightly in the receivers of the others. "Hey, I'm beginning to make things out." So was Lucky, and the fact puzzled him. Surely starlight could not be that bright. There was a faint, luminous haze that lay over the tumbled landscape and touched its sharp crags of pale milkiness. Lucky had seen something of the sort on the moon during its 2-week-long night. There, also, was the completely barren landscape, rough and unbroken. Never in millions of years, either there or on the moon, or here on Mercury, had there been the softening touch of wind or rain. The bare rock, colder than imagination could picture, lay without a touch of frost in a waterless world. And in the moon's night, too, there had been this milkiness. But there, over half the moon, at least, there had been earthlight. When Earth was full, it shone with 16 times the brightness of the full moon as seen from Earth. Here on Mercury, at the solar observatory at the North Pole, there was no nearby planet to account for the light. "Is that starlight?" he finally asked, knowing it wasn't. Scott Mindy said wearily, "That's the coronal glimmer." "Great galaxy," said Lucky with a light laugh. "The corona. Of course, I should have known." "Known what?" cried Bigman. "What's going on? Hey, Mindies, come on, give!" Mindy said, "Turn around, you've got your back to it." They all turned. Lucky whistled softly between his teeth. Bigman yelped with surprise. Mindies said nothing. A section of the horizon was etched sharply against a pearly region of the sky. Every pointed irregularity of that part of the horizon was in keen focus. Above it, the sky was in a soft glow, fading with height, a third of the way to the zenith. The glow consisted of bright, curving streamers of pale light. "That's the corona, Mr. Jones," said Mindies. Even in his astonishment, Bigman was not forgetful of his own conception of the proprieties. He growled, "Call me Bigman." Then he said, "You mean the corona around the sun? I didn't think it was that big." "It's 1,000,000 miles deep or more," said Mindies, "and we're on Mercury, the planet closest to the sun. We're only 30 trillion miles from the sun right now. You're from Mars, aren't you?" "Born and bred," said Bigman. "But if you could see the sun right now, you'd find it was 36 times as big as it is when seen from Mars, and so's the corona, and 36 times as bright, too." Lucky nodded. Sun and corona would be 9 times as large as seen from Earth. And the corona could not be seen at all on Earth, except during periods of total eclipse. Well, Mindies had not altogether lied. There were sights to be seen on Mercury. He tried to fill out the corona, to imagine the sun it surrounded, which was now hidden just below the horizon. It would be a majestic sight. Mindies went on, an unmistakable bitterness in his voice. "They call this light the white ghost of the sun." Lucky said, "I rather like that. A rather good phrase." "Rather good?" said Mindy savagely. "I don't think so. There's too much talk about ghosts on this planet. This planet's all jinx. I think if it goes right on it, the mine's failed." His voice trailed off. Lucky thought, "We'll let that simmer." Aloud he said, "Where is this phenomenon we were to see, Mindies?" "Oh yes, we'll have to walk a bit, not far considering the gravity, but watch your footing. We don't have roads here, and the coronal glimmer can be awfully confusing. I suggest the helmet lights." He clicked his on as he spoke, and a shaft of light sprang out from above the faceplate, turning the ground into a rough patchwork of yellow and black. The two other lights flashed on, and the three figures moved forward on their thickly insulated boots. They made no sound in the vacuum, but each could sense the soft vibration set up by each footfall in the air within their suits. Mindy seemed to be brooding about the planet as he walked. He said in a low, tense voice, "I hate Mercury. I've been here 6 months. 2 Mercurian years. I'm sick of it. I didn't think I'd be here more than 6 months to begin with, and here the time's up and done. Nothing's done. Nothing. Everything about this place is wrong. It's the smallest planet, the closest to the sun. Only one side faces the sun over there." And his arms swung in the direction of the corona's gleam. "It's the sun side where it gets hot enough in place to melt lead and boil sulfur. Over there," again, in the other direction, again his arms swung, "is the one planetary surface in this whole solar system that never sees the sun. Everything about this place is miserable." He paused to jump over a shallow 6-foot-wide rift in the surface, a reminder of some eons-old Mercury quake, perhaps, which could not be heal over without wind and weather. He made the jump clumsily, the picture of an Earthman who, even on Mercury, stayed close to the artificial gravity of the observatory dome. Bigman clicked his tongue disapprovingly at the sight. He and Lucky negotiated the jump of scarcely anything more than a lengthening of stride. A quarter mile further on, Mindy said abruptly, "We can see it from here, and just in time, too." He stopped, teetering forward with his arms outflung for balance. Bigman and Lucky halted with a small hop which kicked up a spurt of gravel. Mindy's helmet flash went out. He was pointing. Lucky and Bigman put out their own lights, and there in the darkness, where Mindy's had pointed, was a small, irregular splotch of white. It was brilliant, a more burning sunshine than Lucky had ever seen on Earth. "This is the best angle for seeing it," said Mindy's. "It's the top of the black and white mountain." "Is that its name?" said Bigman. "That's right, and you see why, don't you? It just stands out just far enough nightward of the Terminator. That's the boundary between the dark side and the sun side." "I know that," said Bigman indignantly. "You think I'm ignorant? I'm just explaining. There's a little spot around the North Pole and another around the South Pole. The Terminator doesn't move much as Mercury circles the sun. Down at the equator now, that the Terminator moves 700 miles in one direction for 44 days and then 700 miles back in the next 44. Here it just moves a half a mile or so altogether, which is why it's a good place for an observatory. The sun and the stars stand still. Anyway, Black and White Mountain is just far enough away so that only the top half of it is lit at most. And then, as the sun creeps away, the light moves up the mountain slopes." "Now," interposed Lucky, "only the peak is lit up." "Only the top foot or two, maybe, and that'll be gone soon. It'll be all dark for another day or two, and then the light starts coming back." Even as he spoke, the white splotch shrank to a dot that burned like a bright star. The three men waited. "Look away," advised Mindy, "so that your eyes get accustomed to the darkness." And after a slow minute, he said, "All right, look back." Lucky and Bigman did so, and for a while saw nothing. And then it was as though the landscape had turned bloody, or a piece of it had at any rate. First there was just the sensation of redness. Then it could be made out, a rugged mountain climbing up to a peak. The peak was brightly red now, the red deepening and fading as the eye traveled downward until all was black. "What is it?" asked Bigman. "The sun," said Mindies, "has sunk just low enough now, so that from the mountain peak all that remains above the horizon is the corona and the prominences. The prominences are jets of hydrogen gas that lift thousands of miles above the sun's surface, and they're bright red in color. The light is there all the time, but the ordinary sunlight drowns it out." Again Lucky nodded. The The prominences were again something which on Earth could only be seen during a total eclipse, or with special instruments thanks to the atmosphere. In fact, added Mindy's in a low voice, they call this the red ghost of the sun. That's two ghosts, said Lucky suddenly, a white one and a red one. Is it because of the ghost that you carry a blaster, Mr. Mindy's? Mindy shouted, What? Then wildly, What are you talking about? I'm saying, said Lucky, that it's time you told us why you really brought us out here. Not just for the sights, I'm sure, or you wouldn't carry a blaster on an empty, desolate planet. It took a while for Mindy's to answer. When he did, he said, You're David Starr, aren't you? That's right, said Lucky patiently. You're a member of the Council of Science. You're the man they call Lucky Starr. Members of the Council of Science shunned publicity, and it was with a certain reluctance that Lucky said again, That's right. Then I'm not wrong. You're one of the ace investigators, and you're here to investigate Project Light. Lucky's lips thinned as they pressed together. He would much rather that were not so easily known. He said, Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. Why did you bring me here? I know it's true, and I brought you here, Mindy's was panting, to tell you the truth before the other could fill you full of lies. About what? About the failures that have been haunting, I hate that word, the failures in Project Light. But you might have told me what you wanted to back at Dome. Why bring me here? For two reasons, said the engineer. His breathing continued rapid and difficult. In the first place, they all think it's my fault. They think I couldn't pull the project through and that I'm wasting tech's money. I wanted to get you away from them, understand? I want you to keep you from listening to them first. Why should they think it's your fault? They think I'm too young. How old are you? 22. Lucky Starr, who wasn't very much older, said, And your second reason? I wanted you to get the feel of Mercury. I wanted you to absorb the... He fell silent. Lucky's suited figure stood straight and tall on Mercury's forbidding surface, and the metal of one shoulder caught and reflected the milky light of the corona, the white ghost of the sun. He said, Very well, Mindies. Suppose I accept your statement that you are not responsible for the failures in the project. Who is? The engineer's voice was a vague mutter at first. It coalesced gradually into words. I don't know, at least... I don't understand you, said Lucky. Look, said Mindies desperately, I've investigated. I've spent every waking and sleeping period trying to pinpoint the blame. I watched everybody's movements. I noticed times when accidents took place, when there were breaks in the cables, or when conversation plates were smashed, and one thing I'm sure of. Which is? That nobody at the Dome can be directly responsible. Nobody. There are only about 50 people in the Dome, 52 to be exact, and the last 6 times something has gone wrong, I've been able to account for each one. Nobody was anywhere near the sites of the accidents. His voice had gone high-pitched. Lucky said, Then how do you account for the accidents? Mercury quakes? Action of the sun? Ghosts! Cried the engineer wildly, flinging his arms about. There's a white ghost and a red ghost, and you've seen those, but they're two-legged ghosts, too. I've seen them, but will anyone believe me? He was almost incoherent. I tell you. Bigman said, Ghost? Ghost? Are you nuts? At once Mindy screamed. You don't believe me either, but I'll prove it. I'll blast that ghost. I'll blast the fools who won't believe me. I'll blast everyone. Everyone! With a harsh screech of laughter, he had drawn his blaster in frenzied speed. Before Bigman could move to stop him, he had aimed it at Lucky at point-blank range and squeezed its trigger. Its invisible fields of disruption lashed out.